He should have walked away the moment she whispered, "Please, don't lift the cloth." But out here, secrets rot faster than fruit in the sun, and curiosity don't keep quiet long. When James Callahan bought the old Turner Ranch, he expected termites and torn shutters, not a woman hiding in the cellar and a table draped in black linen she swore no one should ever touch. He thought she was just scared. Or crazy. But when he pulled the cloth back, he saw something that made his knees buckle. Not just strange, unholy. The kind of thing no decent man should ever look upon. And yet, now that he had, he couldn't unsee it. Or unlive it. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. James Callahan had seen his share of bad land deals, but when the papers were slid across the desk in the county office and the Turner Ranch was named as the property in question, he thought he'd struck something close to a miracle, for the price was so low it was near a joke, and a man down on his luck could not afford to sniff at opportunity. Yet when he rode out past the cedar breaks and across the overgrown pasture, his heart began to realize why no one else had staked their claim. Here the ranch lay in ruin, its fields swallowed in weeds, fences caved and splintered like broken ribs, the house itself a half-burnt carcass squatting black against the horizon, windows hollow as eyes and a roofline sagging under the memory of flame. The locals had called it cursed ground, he remembered, leaning in on their whispers at the saloon, saying no man lasted long after the fire took the Turner family, that the land breathed wrong, as if it resented being worked. But James was too stubborn, too broke, and too tired of running from debt to let ghost stories scare him off. He told himself that boards could be replaced, fences mended, and silence was no curse but a blessing for a man who had lost too much noise in saloons and creditors' mouths. He pitched his bedroll in the parlor that first night, a place still blackened on one wall where the fire had licked but not consumed, and he told himself the creaks and groans of the house were only old wood shifting, the draft at his neck, nothing but holes in the boards. Yet as the moonlight pressed through broken slats, James felt the stillness deepen until it carried weight, a silence that wasn't emptiness but watchfulness. He rolled over, muttering curses at his own nerves, and that was when he heard a faint scrape beneath the floorboards, too slow for rats, too heavy for loose timber. He sat up, rifle in hand, and held his breath, listening, and there it came again, a shuffling drag, followed by the almost imperceptible sound of breath drawn and let go. James lowered himself to the planks, ear pressed against the dust, and his skin prickled as he realized whatever lay beneath was alive. At dawn he pried up a section of flooring with the flat end of his axe, expecting a badger or some other wild thing, but what stared back from the darkness was a pair of eyes, wide, human, and unblinking. With a start, James backed off, rifle raised, but then a shape crawled forward into the spill of light. A woman, thin as a shadow, her hair a wild tangle, her skin smeared with earth, and the way she blinked against the daylight made it plain she had not seen the sun in some time. She said nothing at first, only crouched there, her lips dry and cracked, her breath shallow. And James, stunned into silence, realized that in buying the Turner Ranch, he had bought more than scorched timber and cursed soil. He had inherited a secret the town had buried, a woman alive beneath the floorboards of a house everyone else swore was empty. And in that moment, for the first time, the whispers of cursed ground no longer seemed like the foolishness of drunks, but the faint outline of a truth he was only beginning to glimpse. Miriam was not the kind of apparition James Callahan had expected to find in a house rumored cursed. She was flesh and blood, though pale and wiry like something half-starved of both food and light, barefoot and trembling, her hair a knotted curtain around a face that carried the raw look of someone who had seen too much and been believed too little, her wide eyes darting at every sound the old house made as though she could hear a language in the creaks and groans he could not. When he coaxed her up into the parlor, she hovered barefoot over the boards, refusing to meet his gaze for long, but when he pressed her name from her, it came as a whisper, Miriam, and with it a sudden urgency that had her gripping his sleeve with thin fingers surprisingly strong, hissing through cracked lips that he mustn't disturb the house's balance. The word balance spoken like it was weightier than prayer, heavier than truth itself, and when James frowned and asked what she meant, she turned her gaze toward the parlor table, the one that had sat under a shroud of black cloth since the moment he arrived, its edges sharp under the dust like a coffin set in the middle of the room. Miriam's voice dropped lower as she said, "Don't touch it. It keeps it asleep." the tremor in her tone enough to hollow the space between them, and though James barked out a laugh and said she sounded like a revivalist conjuring up fear for tides, something in her eyes so wild, so fixed on that cloth-draped shape made the laugh die in his throat. He asked her how long she had been here, why she lived like a feral creature in the cellar of a burned ranch. But her answers twisted back to the same plea. Don't move the cloth. Don't wake what rests beneath. James told himself she was mad, broken by trauma, by fire, by solitude, yet even as he thought it, he could not help but notice how her entire body seemed tuned to the house, how she flinched before the timbers cracked, how her breath hitched just as the wind moaned through the rafters, as if she lived on the same pulse as the ranch itself. He tried to brush it off, to tell her he was here to work the land, fix the fences, mend the roof, and that ghost stories were for children, but the way she looked at him pitying almost made his words feel small. That night, as James lay on his bedroll by the hearth, the black-shrouded table looming in the dark like a crouched figure, he told himself it was nothing but furniture, a shape he could strip bare in the morning to prove her wrong. But sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it brought with it a dream so sharp it felt like memory. The table uncovered, something glistening on its surface, and a low, steady breath rising not from his own chest but from the wood itself. He woke with sweat slicking his neck and Miriam's warning whisper lodged like a splinter in his skull. It keeps it asleep, and for the first time since arriving, James wondered if perhaps the house had not been waiting for him to mend it, but to test whether he'd obey the rules Miriam already lived by. The storm rolled in with a violence that rattled the Turner Ranch to its bones, wind clawing at the broken shutters, rain drumming the warped roof in a ceaseless tattoo, and James Callahan, sleepless and half-mad from the hammering of thunder, found his gaze dragged again and again to the parlor table, that brooding silhouette in the center of the room draped in its shroud of black cloth. Miriam had begged him, warned him, pleaded with words trembling on her lips that it must never be touched, that the cloth was the only thing keeping the house in its fragile balance. But James, stubborn as the mule he rode in on, and more than a little worn down by hunger and doubt, told himself that he had survived worse storms than this, worse terrors than a bit of superstition, and if he didn't peel away the mystery soon, it would gnaw him hollow. The lightning flared, spilling its stark white across the cloth, and in that flicker James saw not a table but something watching him, crouching, waiting, and before he could talk himself out of it, his hand moved, seizing the edge of the cloth and yanking it away. What lay beneath stopped his breath. Not a table at all, but a mirror, its frame heavy iron etched with patterns so old they might as well have been claw marks, the glass itself rippling faintly as though it were a pool of water disturbed by breath. But no reflection of the storm-lit room appeared on its surface. Instead, James saw only black, an infinite depth where hints of pale shapes stirred, like faces pressing just out of sight, like eyes straining to see him from a distance that wasn't distance at all. His heart slammed in his chest, yet something compelled him closer, some pull as deep as hunger, and when his fingers brushed the cold iron frame, the world cracked his ears, roared as though a cannon had fired inside his skull, his nose burst with hot blood spilling down over his lip, and behind him, Miriam's scream tore the storm apart, raw and unearthly, not the cry of a girl but of someone being flayed alive by invisible hands. James staggered back, clutching his head, but the mirror seemed to hum now, alive, the dark within it shifting with an eager pulse, and Miriam collapsed to her knees beside him, shrieking words he couldn't understand. Her hands pressed to her temples as though the sound was clawing at her from the inside. The storm outside seemed to answer, the wind screaming through cracks, the timbers groaning under some new weight, and James realized too late that in his arrogance he had broken whatever fragile covenant Miriam had lived under all these years. He tried to recover the mirror, but his hands shook so violently the cloth slipped, sliding uselessly to the floor, and in the glass he thought he saw something move toward him, a pale hand, reaching, stretching, its fingers impossibly long, its nails scraping the barrier between their world and his. He wrenched his gaze away, hauled Miriam into his arms as she writhed like the sound was burning her, and shouted her name over and over until her eyes snapped open, wild and wet with terror. Her voice a ragged whisper at last. It's awake now. And as thunder split the sky, James knew the ranch no one wanted had finally revealed why. The days after James tore away the black cloth were measured not in hours but in fractures of sanity, each one gnawing at his resolve a little deeper. At first it was the cattle, restless in their pens until one morning they broke free entirely, bolting across the fields as if some unseen predator had slid its shadow over them, their panicked cries carrying into the hills until silence swallowed them whole. Then it was the clocks, his old pocket watch, the mantel clock in the parlor. Even the town's bell when he rode in for supplies all faltering, their ticking drawn out until each second felt like it was being stretched thin, then snapping into nothing, leaving only silence where time should have been. And in the dark hours, when sleep should have come like a balm, James would lie rigid on his bedroll, hearing voices threading through the boards of the house, whispers that seemed to come from under the floor and above the roof at once, voices that called his name not with familiarity but with hunger, promising him rest if only he would listen harder, if only he would look deeper into the glass. Miriam fared worse, her strength drained as though the sickness of the house had chosen her as vessel, her body shivering even under heavy quilts, her lips spilling words James did not know, guttural and broken, syllables that carried the weight of something older than scripture, words that made the candlelight gutter and lean away as though frightened. When James tried to hold her still, to stop the muttering, her eyes rolled white and her voice deepened until it was no longer hers but something borrowed, a tongue that smelled of dust and grave rot. Desperate, James sought answers from the town, riding in under a sky the color of lead, his face gaunt and his clothes stained with the soot of sleepless nights. When he asked the barkeep about the Turner name, silence spread through the saloon like wildfire. Men avoided his eyes, cards went still in hands, until finally an old rancher spat into the sawdust and muttered that Silas Turner had been no ordinary rancher but a warlock who had bartered his soul for prosperity, making some unholy pact with the land itself. The ranch had thrived once, they said, crops that never withered, cattle that never sickened, but such blessings come with teeth. And when the debt came due, Silas vanished, swallowed by his own bargain. The mirror, the old man claimed, had been his altar, the vessel of his power, and when the Turner house burned, it should have been destroyed with the rest. That it had survived meant only one thing: Silas's deal was not done. James rode back heavy with dread, the whispers from townsfolk chasing him, and when he stepped into the house, he found Miriam curled on the floor near the mirror, her lips moving in that dead tongue, her hands clawing at her chest as though trying to rip something out. The mirror pulsed faintly, not with reflection but with movement behind its glass, the shadows shifting like a tide, pressing closer. James knelt beside her, torn between hauling the mirror out to smash it against the stones and leaving it shrouded as Miriam begged, but in his heart he knew the curse was already awake, and whatever Silas Turner had bargained for was not finished with this land, nor with anyone foolish enough to claim it. James Callahan had always thought himself a practical man, steady-handed and slow to fright. But by the 5th day after the cloth was torn away, he found the ranch pressing against his mind like a vice, squeezing out reason until every breath felt borrowed. He had saddled the bay at dawn, intent on riding hard for the next county, yet no matter which trail he chose, north along the creek bed, east across the ridgeline, or south through the cedar, breaks the world bent itself into cruel mockery, the road folding back upon itself until the charred skeleton of the Turner house rose before him again, standing smug in the pale light like it had been waiting for him to circle back. Sweat ran cold down his back each time he dismounted to check the sun, certain he must have veered by accident. But no, every direction led only here, to cursed soil that would not let him go. Worse were the reflections. The first time he noticed it was in the parlor window, the glass murky with smoke stains, yet clear enough that he caught the image of himself smiling wide while his own mouth stayed shut, the grin so sharp it showed too many teeth. Later it happened in the trough water, his reflection leaning closer though he had not moved, lips whispering words he could not hear. By nightfall it had grown unbearable, every shard of glass, every ripple of water threatening to betray him with that other version that wore his face but not his soul. He smashed the small mirror in the bedroom first, the glass cutting his palm as if punishing him for the act, then moved room by room, prying boards loose and nailing them across every pane until the house became a coffin of darkened wood. No light save for the flicker of lanterns and the relentless pulse from the shrouded mirror in the parlor. Miriam, pale and fevered, watched him from her cot with eyes too old for her face, murmuring that it was useless, that the glass in the parlor was the root, and all others were only shadows of its hunger. When James snarled that he would burn it, drag it into the yard and smash it to dust, she shook her head weakly and whispered, "It doesn't want you, James. It never did. It wants freedom." Her words hollowed him, made his guts twist, because he had thought himself the target of this haunting, cursed for his arrogance. But now he saw it differently. The mirror did not care for him. Not as a man. Not even as a soul. It wanted the world outside. The air, the hills, the town, every road and face and beast. And James had been the fool who cracked the lock. That night he sat awake with his rifle across his knees, the boards over the windows groaning in the wind, Miriam muttering in her sleep in that dead tongue, and the mirror behind its cloth whispering without sound, pressing at the edges of his mind with the insistence of a prisoner testing weak bars. And James knew that if he faltered, if he gave it so much as a glance, the smile in its glass would not be his own, it would be the world's last. The attic groaned like the ribcage of some buried beast when James pried his way up through the hatch, lantern hissing in his grip, the air stale with decades of dust and the faint char of fire that hadn't quite claimed the rafters. He hadn't meant to search, not at first, but sleepless nights and Miriam's worsening fever drove him higher, desperate for any clue that might explain what had rooted itself into the marrow of the Turner Ranch. And it was there, tucked beneath a stack of rotted blankets and rust-bitten tools, that he found the journal, its leather cover cracked, edges flaking like dried blood, the name Silas Turner carved in a hand both elegant and frantic, the script inside sprawling across pages thick with ink blot and smudge, as though each word had been spilled as much as written. James sat cross-legged under the slanted roof, lantern casting monstrous shadows, and began to read. Rituals catalogued in careful detail, blood oaths written with precision that made his skin crawl, diagrams of circles and symbols that hurt his eyes if he stared too long, their geometry wrong in a way that made him feel seasick. Silas wrote of the veil, a barrier between this world and something older, hungrier, a thin skin of reality that could be punctured if one knew the rights. And in the mirror, Silas had found both key and cage, a vessel that could hold what clawed from the other side. The early entries read like triumph, a man drunk on power, describing how crops never failed and cattle fattened in half the time, how storms bent away from his fields, how neighbors whispered envy while his barns swelled with plenty. But as James turned the brittle pages, the tone shifted, triumph curdling into dread. The blessings came at a price, voices whispering at night, faces pressing at the glass, shadows that lingered too long, demanding more blood, more devotion, and Silas, in his pride, had given it sacrifices hinted at in lines scratched over, oaths sealed in crimson ink that looked too much like rusted bloodstains to be anything but. The final entries were near incoherent, words slashed across the page with a shaking hand. It sees me when I sleep. It wants the world. The cloth keeps it dreaming. If the cloth comes off, run. Run. James stared at those words until his vision blurred, the echo of Miriam's warning rising like bile in his throat. But he could not run. Not now. Not when he had already pulled the cloth away. Not when the thing in the glass had caught sight of him. Even in the attic he felt its pull, the mirror downstairs whispering through the boards, tugging at his mind like a hook in meat. He closed the journal with hands gone cold, his pulse hammering in his ears. And for a moment he thought he saw movement in the lantern flame, a reflection that wasn't his own teeth glinting in a grin too wide, eyes that blinked a fraction after he did. The warning was useless. Escape was no longer possible. Silas Turner had bargained and failed, and now James was caught in the same snare. The cloth gone, the veil thinning, and the mirror hungry with an appetite that reached beyond him, beyond Miriam, into the bones of the land itself. He descended the attic ladder with the journal clutched to his chest, every step heavier than the last, the house groaning as though it knew he carried the confession of its damnation. And from the parlor below he swore he heard his own voice calling his name. Miriam's confession came not in some grand declaration but in the hushed dark of a night thick with the stink of storm. When James sat by the hearth with Silas Turner's journal open on his knees, the words, "If the cloth comes off," run burning holes in his mind. And she, pale and hollow-eyed, rose from her cot with a strength that seemed borrowed from the shadows themselves. She crouched beside him, her hair tangled, her lips cracked, and she said quietly, "You've read enough to know, haven't you? It doesn't want to be fed, it wants to be freed." James nodded, his throat tight. But before he could speak, she laid her thin hand on the journal and pushed it closed, her eyes shimmering with a sorrow too old for her face. "I wasn't hiding here because I had nowhere else," she whispered, voice shaking. "I was hiding because this house doesn't let us go. I am blood of Silas Turner. His sin wound into me like marrow. Every generation, one of us is bound here, watching the mirror, keeping it under cloth, keeping it dreaming. If the line breaks, if there's no guardian, the veil tears open." James felt a chill creep up his spine, his mind flashing through the strange loops of the road, the reflections that smiled without him, the way the house held him prisoner as surely as chains. He rasped out, "So it's you. You're the guardian." Miriam's mouth twisted, half bitter, half broken. "I was. But the mirror doesn't sleep anymore. You woke it. And now it wants more than me, it wants a trade." Her gaze fixed on him then, steady as iron. "It sees you. It has your shape in its glass. It will not stop until you stand where I stood, until you bind yourself to this place and carry the curse in my stead. If you refuse—" She faltered. But the house groaned around them, and the mirror in the parlor hummed low like a beast stirred from slumber, finishing her sentence without words. The thing inside would not stay caged. James's heart pounded, fury and dread colliding in him. He had come to this ranch for land, for silence, for the chance to build something out of ruin, not to be shackled to the damnation of a dead warlock's bloodline. Yet when he looked at Miriam, thin as a candle's shadow and trembling under the weight of a burden she had carried too long, he felt the cruel hook of duty, because hadn't he already been a soldier, a man who stood in the gap while others lived? And wasn't this just another war, only against a hunger that wore his face in the glass? Still, he shook his head, muttering, "There's got to be another way." But Miriam only closed her eyes, her breath catching as though the mirror itself tightened around her lungs. "There isn't," she said, and when she opened her eyes again, they were wet with tears but steady with resignation. "If you don't take my place, the thing in that glass will take yours, and then the world outside won't know quiet nights again." As thunder cracked overhead and the boards shuddered, James realized the cursed ranch had cornered him into a choice no man should have to make: chain himself to its endless hunger, or unleash it upon everything beyond these dying fields. James had told himself he would never bend, that no cursed glass or whispering relic could break the will of a man who had trudged through war and famine and the endless failures of bad seasons. Yet the house wore him down like a whetstone on a blade, and the night the mirror tried to take his place was the one that finally stripped him of defiance. He had fallen into restless sleep, Silas Turner's journal clutched to his chest like a shield, only to wake with the feeling of breath on his face that wasn't his own. And when he turned, lantern sputtering low, he saw himself standing by the mirror, his own shape, his own broad shoulders and hollow cheeks. Only the reflection did not move when he did, and when he rose with rifle in hand, the double only grinned, raising its arm a heartbeat late, mockery carved in its delay, eyes gleaming with a hunger that was his and not his. The boards rattled as if to split, and Miriam screamed from her cot, shrill as a dying bird, her voice breaking in some ancient tongue until the thing in the glass staggered, fractured, and slipped back into the black, leaving James trembling and soaked in sweat, the taste of iron on his tongue like he'd bitten through his own mouth. At dawn, he told her flatly, voice scraped raw, "I'll do it. Whatever this ritual is, we'll do it." Miriam nodded, her face pale but carrying the grim resolve of someone born to a burden she had never chosen. She fetched from the cellar a small box lined with salt and bone shards, objects wrapped in faded cloth that reeked of old blood, and laid them before the mirror, its surface shifting faintly like water waiting to be stirred. She told him the truth he had not yet heard in full. The mirror did not sleep willingly. It slept only when it was fed, when it was given what it craved: blood for its hunger, memory for its longing, and that was why the Turner line had been bound to it, generation after generation. Because to sate the mirror was to carve pieces out of yourself and hand them over, letting it drink without ever letting it feast. James bristled, saying he would rather smash the cursed thing to shards, But Miriam shook her head, eyes fierce. Shatter it, and it scatters every shard, another mouth, another door. Contain it, or it will spread. So he bit back his rage, drew his knife, and with the weight of every oath he had sworn as a soldier pressing against him, he bared his arm to the blade and let his blood fall into the bowl she placed at the mirror's base. The glass rippled, sighing like a beast fed, and then came the harder part, memory. Miriam explained that to give memory was to surrender pieces of himself forever, to let the mirror drink what made him whole, and though every instinct screamed against it, James closed his eyes and whispered his mother's face, her smile at the porch of a house long lost, the way her voice carried when she called him to supper as a boy, and when the words left his lips, the image left him too. He reached for it and found only emptiness, the memory stripped clean. Tears burned his eyes, but the mirror drank it with greedy shivers, its surface darkening until the whispers dulled. Miriam cut her own palm, blood dripping alongside his, her breath hitching as she offered up a memory of her father's hands lifting her from the ashes of the first fire she'd survived, and as both blood and memory seeped into the ritual, the mirror's surface smoothed, its hum softening like a predator lulled into slumber. When it stilled at last, Miriam sank against the wall, pale and shaking, and James sat beside her, hollowed out, the weight of his missing memory leaving him raw. "It will sleep now," she whispered. For a time. But James, staring at the black glass, knew hunger only ever slept lightly. And one day it would wake again, demanding more than either of them could afford to give. When James woke, dawn was pressing pale through the cracks in the boarded windows, the storm finally broken, the house holding a silence so complete it rang in his ears. For a long moment he thought perhaps he had dreamed it all. The mirror's hunger, the ritual, Miriam's trembling hands, but then he rose and staggered into the parlor to find the cloth restored, heavy and black, draped perfectly over the mirror, as though it had never been disturbed, the folds hanging with an almost reverent precision, and the air around it felt subdued, like a beast sated for now. Yet there was no sign of Miriam. Her cot was neatly made, her thin shoes gone, her presence erased so thoroughly it was as if she had been swallowed by the house itself. Only a note remained, scrawled on a torn page from Silas Turner's journal and pinned beneath a stone on the parlor table. "Keep it covered. Whatever happens, don't forget." James read it once, then again, the words carrying a finality that pressed into him like a brand, and though his chest ached at the emptiness of the house without her, some part of him understood Miriam had been the last thread of the Turner bloodline, and the mirror had taken what it wanted, either in blood or in bargain, leaving James as the only soul left to bear the weight. He stepped outside into the crisp light, the prairie stretching endless and raw before him. And for the first time since he'd set foot on the ranch, the road ran straight. No loops, no tricks of the land, only a clean line out toward the horizon, a promise of escape laid bare. He saddled the bay and rode to the crest, staring out at that open road, freedom finally within reach, the sun rising at his back as if urging him onward. But when he tightened the reins, the horse shifted, uneasy, and James's own gut twisted, because he knew the mirror would not stay silent without a keeper, that the cloth would not hold forever unless watched, that every mile he rode away was another inch of slack in a rope that should never be loosed. He thought of Miriam's note, of the blood spilled, of the memory torn from him and left forever in the glass, and he knew that whatever he was now, it was not a free man but a sentinel. Slowly, with the weight of resignation heavy as armor, he turned the horse back toward the ranch, watching the road straighten and stretch behind him like a temptation he would never again take. The Turner ranch loomed on the horizon, blackened timbers and sagging roofline, but now it was his burden alone, the role he had inherited not by choice but by the cruelty of fate. The new keeper, chained to cursed ground. As he dismounted and looked once more at the silent house, James whispered to the wind, "I won't forget," and though no voice answered, the boards creaked softly, as though the ranch itself had accepted his vow. The years bled together on the Turner ranch like ink soaking into paper, each season folding into the next until James Callahan could not tell whether he was 35 or 50, whether it had been 5 winters or 10 since Miriam vanished into the silence she left behind. The house sagged further, the fields grew wild again, fences rotted and fell, but the mirror never changed, never dulled, its shape hunched beneath the black cloth in the parlor like a crouching beast waiting for its chain to slip. And James learned to live around it as one learns to live with an old wound, never touching, never forgetting, always wary of the way it ached when storms rolled in. He became the ghost the townsfolk whispered about, a hermit who rode to town only rarely for flour or salt, his eyes hollow, his hair gone long and gray, muttering warnings no one wanted to hear. Stay clear of the Turner place. Don't wander near the cedars. Don't step foot in the parlor. They laughed at him in the saloon, called him touched by fire, but none dared test him, for there was something in his stare that said he had seen further than men were meant to. And so the ranch was left to him, as it always had been to someone, his exile both curse and covenant. But one morning, as the first light seeped through the cracks of the ruined roof, James shuffled into the parlor with his coffee and stopped cold because the cloth had moved. Not much, only a ripple, a soft fold where once it had hung smooth, but the sight froze him as surely as a rifle at his chest. He stood for a long time, breath locked in his lungs, staring at that ripple, half expecting the cloth to slide away entirely and reveal the black glass beneath, the smile that wasn't his waiting there. The silence deepened until it felt like the house itself was holding its breath with him. And James understood in that moment that the hunger behind the mirror never truly slept, that his blood and his memory had bought only borrowed years, not freedom. Slowly, with the steadiness of a man who knew panic would only quicken the end, he set down his cup, went to the desk in the corner, and pulled a scrap of paper from the dwindling stack. His hand trembled, but the words came easy, the same that Miriam had left for him, the same that Silas had scrawled in terror long before. Keep it covered. Whatever happens, don't forget. He pressed the pencil harder until the letters cut grooves into the wood beneath, knowing this note, too, would outlive him. For the ranch had a hunger that spanned generations, and he was only the latest keeper in a line that would stretch long after his bones were dust. Folding the note, James set it by the stone on the parlor table, his eyes never leaving that ripple in the cloth, and for the first time in years he whispered a prayer, not for deliverance, not for peace, but for the strength to hold the line a little longer. The Turner Ranch had chosen him, as it had chosen Miriam, as it had chosen Silas before, and now he was the guardian, bound to cursed ground that would never let him go, listening to the faint hum behind the cloth and waiting for the day it stirred again.